my mother-in-law showed up at our front door on a Tuesday morning with a man none of us had ever seen before. And she introduced him as her husband. Not her boyfriend. Not someone she was dating. Her husband. His name was Preston. And he looked like he couldn't have been older than 22. I stood in the doorway holding a mug of coffee I hadn't even taken a sip from yet, and I just stared. Behind me, my husband Joel. Wait, I keep doing that. His name is Joel in my head, but I should say his name for you. My husband's name is Miles. Miles stood at the kitchen counter with a dish towel over his shoulder, and when he came to see what I was looking at, the towel just slid off and hit the floor, and he didn't even notice. His mother's name is Beverly. She's 63 years old. She has silver hair she always keeps pinned up. She wears the same pearl earrings she wore at our wedding, and she has never in the 14 years I've known her done a single impulsive thing. Not one. This is a woman who makes her grocery list in alphabetical order. This is a woman who scheduled her own knee surgery around the timing of her book club. And she was standing on our porch in October, glowing like a teenager, holding the hand of a man who still had the kind of jawline that belongs on a college swim team. We got married last weekend, Beverly said, like she was telling us she'd finally gotten around to repainting the guest room. In Sedona. Just the two of us. I hope you understand. I did not understand. Miles found his voice before I did. He said, Mom. And then nothing else came out. Preston smiled at both of us. He had this calm, unhurried smile, like he'd expected exactly this reaction and had already made peace with it. He reached out and shook Miles's hand. I know this is a lot, he said. I told Beverly we should have called first. Beverly waved that off. Calling first gives people time to talk you out of things, she said. She wasn't wrong. If she'd called, Miles would have driven to her house immediately and talked for 3 hours, and Beverly, to keep the peace, would have quietly put the whole thing on pause. I know because that's how it's always worked between them. Miles has strong opinions, and Beverly has always loved him too much to fight, so she hadn't called. We let them in. What else were we going to do? I put more coffee on, and Miles sat across from Preston at the kitchen table with the expression of someone defusing a bomb. Preston was a landscape architect, he told us. He'd done a project near Beverly's neighborhood about 8 months ago, redesigning a community garden on the edge of her subdivision, and they'd met when Beverly came out one afternoon to ask if he could save the old oak tree near the property line. He saved it, Beverly said, and the way she looked at him when she said it made my stomach do something complicated. Preston was 26, not 22. I felt slightly better about that for about 4 seconds, and then I did the math again and felt worse. Beverly was 63. Miles asked the question I was thinking. How long have you actually known each other? 8 months, Beverly said. 8 months, Miles repeated. That's long enough, Beverly said simply. Miles looked at me across the table. I looked back at him. We had been together for 6 years before we got married, and we still sometimes felt like we were figuring each other out. 8 months. 8 months. Miles's brother Declan called that evening. He lived 2 states away, in Nashville, and apparently Beverly had made similar visits to all 3 of her children in sequence, like a tour. Declan had gotten the news at noon. Miles's sister Roz had gotten it at 3. We were the last stop on the circuit, probably because we lived closest and Beverly knew Miles would be the hardest. Declan's reaction, which Miles relayed to me after the call, was pretty much what you'd expect. He was furious. Not at Beverly personally, but at the situation, at the potential for disaster, at the very specific fear that Preston was after something. Their father had passed away 6 years earlier and left Beverly comfortable. Not rich, but comfortable. The house was paid off. There was a retirement account. There was a life insurance payout that Beverly had never touched because, in her words, she couldn't figure out what Marcus would have wanted her to do with it. Declan and Roz and Miles had all assumed, not unreasonably, that someday that money would come back to the family. I want to be honest with you here. I understood their concern. I did. But I also noticed, sitting in our kitchen that night, after Beverly and Preston had gone back to Beverly's house mutts, that most of what Declan talked about on that call was money. They talked about the retirement account. They talked about the house. They talked about what a 26-year-old landscape architect could possibly see in a 63-year-old woman. And I sat there thinking, what if he just loves her? I didn't say it out loud. It wasn't the right moment. The weeks after that were uncomfortable in the way that only family situations can be uncomfortable. Not explosive, not dramatic, just this low constant hum of tension that gets into everything. Sunday dinners felt like negotiations. Phone calls between Miles and his siblings went longer and longer, and usually ended with someone saying, "I just think we need to be careful," without specifying careful about what. Exactly. Beverly invited us all to her house for Thanksgiving. She and Preston had moved into her house. His apartment lease was up, and it made sense, Beverly said, because her house was bigger. Miles drove to Thanksgiving white-knuckled the entire way, and I spent the 40-minute car ride trying to calibrate something to say that wasn't either dismissive of his feelings or quietly judgmental of his motives. I landed on nothing. I just put my hand on his arm. Preston cooked. That was the first surprise. Beverly had always done Thanksgiving herself, had specific recipes she'd made every year since before Miles was born, and I had braced for some version of those dishes to appear on the table out of obligation. Instead, Preston had taken over the kitchen entirely and made something that was clearly his own tradition: a dry brin turkey, roasted root vegetables with pomegranate seeds, a sweet potato dish that had cardamom in it. It was the best Thanksgiving food I'd ever eaten at that table. Declan didn't eat much. Roz was polite but brittle. Miles ate 2 plates and then looked guilty about it. After dinner, Preston washed every dish without being asked, and Beverly sat in the living room with her grandchildren, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. Genuinely relaxed. Not the careful, measured contentment she'd had in the years after Marcus died, where she smiled at the right moments and participated in everything but was never quite all the way present. This was different. She was laughing at things that weren't even that funny. She reached over and squeezed Roz's daughter's hand just because the little girl said something sweet. I watched all of this from the doorway to the kitchen, and I thought, she's happy. She is genuinely, unmistakably happy. I still didn't know anything about Preston. Not really. And something in the back of my head kept catching on a detail I couldn't quite name. It started with the phone. This is going to sound small. But Beverly had always been the kind of person who left her phone on the counter and didn't think twice about it. She'd step away and come back, and it would just be sitting there. She wasn't secretive. She wasn't the kind of person who carried her phone everywhere or silenced notifications when other people were around. But now she kept it face down. Every surface she set it on, she set it face down. And once, when it buzzed and I happened to glance over, she picked it up so fast it was almost a flinch. I told myself it was nothing. Newly married people have private conversations. That's normal. Then there was the room. Beverly's house has 3 bedrooms. The master, which she and Marcus had shared and which she and Preston now shared. A guest room. And a 3rd room at the end of the hallway that had always been used for storage. Boxes of Marcus's things. Holiday decorations. The elliptical machine that nobody ever used. Sometime in November, that door started being kept closed. Which sounds like nothing. It was a storage room. Of course, the door was closed. But it had never been closed before. Beverly wasn't precious about it. When we visited, we'd walk right past it to get to the guest bathroom, and the door was always open, and you could see the stacked boxes and the elliptical and the bins labeled XMAS and Easter in Beverly's handwriting. Now it was shut. And there was a new lock on it. A sliding bolt installed on the outside of the door. I noticed it in December when we came for Miles's birthday dinner. I was walking to the guest bathroom and I stopped and looked at it for a second and then kept walking. I didn't mention it that night. But I thought about it on the drive home. A bolt on the outside of a storage room door. That's a lock that keeps things in, not out. In January, Beverly called Miles to say that she and Preston were taking a few days for themselves and would he mind coming by to water the plants and pick up the mail. Miles went on a Wednesday. I went with him because I had a half day and honestly because I wanted to see that door again. The bolt was still there, and from behind the door, while Miles was in the kitchen going through the mail, and I was standing in that hallway, I heard something. It was faint, a sound like, I don't know how to describe it exactly, not a voice, not quite. More like the sound a person makes when they're trying not to make a sound. A short, controlled exhale or a shifting of weight or something. I stood very still. It came again. This soft sound, like breathing, like someone sitting very still and trying not to be heard. I knocked on the door. Silence. I said, "Hello." Nothing, I told Miles. He came out of the kitchen and I told him what I'd heard, and he looked at the bolt and I watched his face do several things in quick succession. Confusion, unease, and then, under all of it, something that looked like fear. He knocked on the door, harder than I had. Still nothing. We left and called Beverly on the way home. She picked up after 1 ring, which meant she wasn't that far away, and she said, "Oh, that room. I've been using it for a new project, I need the space to be contained. It's nothing. She laughed a little when she said it. The laugh was fine, but the explanation was slightly too quick, like she'd had it ready. Miles and I didn't sleep well that night. 2 weeks later, we were back at Beverly's for a Sunday dinner, and this time, Declan had driven up from Nashville with his wife, Pam, because Roz had called some kind of unofficial family meeting. Not a confrontation, Roz said. Just dinner. Just all of them together. Preston cooked again. Pot roast this time. It smelled incredible. I sat at the table and ate and watched Declan watching Preston with this fixed, careful expression, like he was looking for something and hadn't found it yet. After dinner, Preston went to the kitchen to clean up. Beverly was in the living room with Pam and Roz. Miles and Declan and I were standing in the dining room still, and I heard it, from down the hall, a sound that was absolutely, unmistakably, a human voice. Not loud, but clear. One syllable muffled from behind that closed door. Miles heard it too. I saw it on his face. He walked down the hall. I followed. Declan was right behind us. Miles knocked on the door and said, "Is someone in there?" Silence. And then, not silence. A voice, thin and strained, said something that sounded like please. Miles hit the bolt with the flat of his hand and slid it back and opened the door. The room was dim. The overhead light was off and the one window had a blackout curtain pulled across it. The elliptical was still there, pushed to one side. The boxes were still stacked along the far wall. And in a recliner in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, was a woman. She was young. I'd guess mid-30s, and she looked exhausted in the specific way that people look when they've been sick and trying to hide it. Her hair was pulled back loose. She had a bottle of water on the floor beside her, and a small table with some medication on it, and her phone plugged into the wall. She looked up at us, and the expression on her face was the most complicated thing I've ever seen. Relief and mortification and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. Beverly appeared behind us in the doorway. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, I was going to tell you." The woman in the chair was named Iris. She was Preston's older sister. She'd been living in that room for 6 weeks. Iris had been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer the previous fall. She had lived alone for years, in an apartment in Phoenix, and when the diagnosis came, she had health insurance through her job but no one to help her through it. No partner. No family nearby. Their parents had both passed. Preston was her only sibling. She'd started chemo in November, and by December she was too sick to take care of herself and too proud to say so. Preston had brought her here because Beverly had offered. Beverly, who had lost her husband to a long illness, who knew exactly what it looked like to try to go through something like that without enough support, had told Preston on the phone, "Bring her here. There is room. I know what to do." But Iris hadn't wanted anyone to know. She was deeply, fiercely private. She had made Preston and Beverly promise not to tell people, not even the family. She was humiliated by the illness, by the need, by all of it. And Beverly had honored that promise because she understood it, even when it meant keeping secrets from her own children. The bolt on the outside of the door was because Iris had dizzy spells during chemo and had fainted once getting up too fast. The bolt meant she couldn't wander out in the night half-conscious. It was a safety measure. Iris had agreed to it. The face-down phone, the closed door, the 2 quick explanations. All of it was Iris's privacy, wrapped up in Beverly's loyalty to a young woman who was just trying to get through something terrible, with whatever dignity she could hold on to. Declan sat down on one of the storage boxes and didn't say anything for a long time. Roz started crying. Quietly, in that way she cries where she's clearly furious at herself for crying. Miles looked at Beverly and said, "Why didn't you just tell us?" Beverly looked at him steadily. "Because it wasn't mine to tell. There was nothing to say to that. There really wasn't." I crossed the room and sat down near Iris, and I asked her if she needed anything. And she looked at me with those exhausted eyes and said no, but thank you. And I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, and I went to the kitchen and made her a cup of tea anyway. When I came back, Miles was crouched next to her chair talking to her quietly. Declan had come in and introduced himself. Roz was asking Beverly something in the hallway, something about doctors and whether Iris had everything she needed, and Beverly was answering with the kind of detailed competence that comes from having done this already, from having gone through it once before with Marcus, from knowing which questions matter and which ones don't. Preston came and stood next to his sister, and she reached up and held his hand, and that was the whole picture, right there. That's what I keep coming back to when I think about this. He hadn't married Beverly for the house or the retirement account. He'd married her because she was the kind of person who says bring her here and means it. And that's not a quality you find everywhere, and when you find it, especially when your sister is sick and scared and alone in Phoenix, you hold on to it. That's not calculation. That's love with a very specific shape. Iris stayed through the end of her treatment, which wrapped up in late March. She's back in Phoenix now, recovering. Her last scan came back clean. Beverly and Preston had a small family celebration dinner when they got the news. Preston made his pomegranate roasted vegetables again. Declan flew up for it. Roz brought the girls. I sat at that table and watched Beverly laugh. And I thought about the grocery list alphabetized by category, and the pearl earrings, and the way she'd stood on our porch in October, radiating something I hadn't had a word for at the time. I have a word for it now. She'd been trusted with something precious, someone else's worst moment, and she'd carried it without making it about herself. And that kind of trustworthiness has a specific glow to it when you finally recognize it. Miles apologized to Beverly, separately, privately, a few weeks after we found Iris. He told me about it later. He said he'd told her he was sorry for how he'd been, for the weeks of suspicion, for the money conversations. Beverly had listened and then said, "You were trying to protect me, you just needed a little more information." He asked her if she was happy. She said she had never been more sure of anything in her adult life. I believe her. And more than that, I'm glad she didn't call ahead.